Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, the Gospels, really right here, and we're looking at the 250 events in the life of Jesus. And today we're going to hit. This is a hard one. Jesus criticizes the religious leaders, and this comes from Luke 11 verses 37 through 54. So I'm going to actually go through most of this, just because I want to dive into this one a little bit. So I will warn you ahead of time. This one is going to be a little bit longer, but I think it's worth it, and it's really important because yesterday we are looking at right receiving the light and being the light of the world. And there's no it's not a coincidence that this happened in this order and that Luke actually put it in this order. So what we're looking at here is Jesus coming down hard on the religious leaders. And so yesterday we looked at this and we saw where he talked about being the light of the world and not letting and not letting a darkness come in thinking it's light, right? That make sure to test and make sure that you have the light of Christ in you and that you don't have darkness which you think is light, which is we talked about a little bit. We see that a lot in the religious circles in Christianity today. And so as Jesus was saying this, right? So we're going to pick up in verse 37 here. As Jesus was saying this, one of the Pharisees invited him over for a meal. So he went and took a place at the table. His host was amazed to see that he sat down to eat without first performing the hand washing ceremony, right? And so they said something, that he was amazed by that. And so the Lord says something to him. So I'm going to stop right there, and I'm actually going to kind of go back and forth with my notes here. The hand washing ceremony, it was done for health reasons, not for health reasons, right? But it was a ceremonial symbol of washing hands, getting rid of contamination, stuff like that. So not only did the Pharisees make a public showing of washing their hands, they also commanded everyone to follow it. It was again following along with this, putting on a show for everything that they would do. And so they like to think of themselves as clean, but the way they were, right? The way they were towards God, the way they were towards the poor, and everything like that, proved that they were not as clean as they thought they were. And so that's the thing that we're going to focus on here. And so we got to dive into this a little bit and see, but so he's amazed. Hey, look, he's not doing the hand washing ceremony that we all do and we all make a big show of. He's just going in and eating. He's not washing his hands. And so Jesus looks at him and says to him, "You Pharisees are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy." Right? He doesn't. Jesus does not hold back here, and we're going to see he does this later again in Matthew, and in this time, right? The things that he says to them I don't want to use the words like he cussed someone out, but he insults them greatly, right? He is very insulting to them. He basically calls them, we want to say calls them names, but he does calls them, and he just reprimands them and goes straight into them. He says in verse 40, right? He says, inside you are full of greed and wickedness at the end of 39. And then in 40, he says, fools, he calls them fools. Didn't God make the inside as well as the outside? So clean the inside by giving gifts to the poor, and you will be clean all over. And so what he's calling out here is that they did not, right? They weren't taking care of the poor. They weren't doing the things that they were supposed to. That's why Jesus heavily went to the poor, those who were in need. There were so many people in need, and they were all around, and these Pharisees are running around with their money and their power, and they're not taking care of the people. It's similar to what we see today. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that. And so the question is, are you generous in meeting the needs of the people around it? Are you do well with the resources God's entrusted you? How do you use them? Are you using them to help people? Are you just being greedy like they are and hoarding everything? And so we need to make sure that we're careful with that. Now, it doesn't mean we give absolutely everything away, but we should be helping those in need around us. And so, um, it's easy to rationalize not helping other people, right? Because some of us will be like, well, I gave to the church. Now it's the church's job to do that. We are the church. We have to remember that, right? And it's not a few people in the church's responsibility to take care of other people or to look out for other people. It's every single one of us. It's every single one of our jobs to do that. So we need to make sure that we're not doing that. So a person that follows Jesus, right, should share with their needy neighbors as well. And we've already looked at the Good Samaritan. We looked at that. We know what a neighbor is, right? It's not just the person that lives next door to you. It's everyone. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that. And so he, man, he just criticizes them sharply. The Pharisees, right, right, because they wash their outsides, but they not their insides, right? They made this appearance, right? And the churches, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to come down real hard on the church, but this is a problem we have, right? And one of the things I've always said is, look, we've got to look in the mirror, we've got to talk about the issues, we've got to address the things that we see. We can't too long we've gone on and just ignored a lot of the problems that are in the church, just pretending like they hadn't happened, or just sweep everything under the rug and we move on, and that's not how we should be working, right? We should definitely be taking care of these issues that we see. And so I'm going to be a little critical right here in this instance, and not and I want you to understand my criticism is more for institutionalized religion more than anything, and not Christians themselves, because it's what's happened as we've institutionalized everything, right? We've set up positions of power incorrectly, right? Or I mean, because it shouldn't be positions of power, but that's the main idea behind a lot of our pastors and elders and even some of our deacon positions like this. Like, oh well, these men are in charge, and they're it's like that's not how it was supposed to be, right? That wasn't the mindset that we were supposed to have, and so we need to make sure we get rid of that Pharisaic mindset and move to a shepherding, helping, serving people mindset. That was what was initially supposed to be there. And so the Pharisees, right? It was all about outside appearances, and I've seen this so many. I mean, I've sat in meetings where it was discussed that we were more concerned about what people thought about us, right, than what we were actually doing. I mean, we were making decisions based on what the church down the street would think of us, not what the Bible said, but what the other churches in our group might say. And that's just I mean, that again, that's a Pharisaic mindset. So we need to remember that we don't do that. They loved praise and attention, right? They sought after that. They loaded people down with burdens, like burdensome religious demands that they could not. They were ridiculous. They would not accept the truth about Jesus. And honestly, believe it or not, there's people in the church today who don't accept the truth about Jesus, right? We still have some of this mindset of, well, we have to earn what Jesus gives us. We have to, those type of things. They're like, no, you don't understand who Jesus was in a lot of sense. And so the other thing they did is they prevented others from believing the truth. And that's probably I think that's the thing that probably got Jesus more than anything is, one, you know what, if you're going to be the way you are, that's fine, be the way you are. But you'll see him focus heavily on the fact that they weren't taking care of other people. They weren't doing things the way they were supposed to be doing. But the biggest thing you see is that they were hurting religiously and keeping people from coming to the truth of who Jesus was. And when you're doing that, man, that's a danger. It's a dangerous position to be sitting in front of Jesus and the people he's trying to reach. I just would not be. And so they were doing this, and so they were focused on outside appearances. Right? They were wrong for that. They were focused on that and ignoring the inner condition of their hearts. They were ignoring the conditions of their hearts, and they were justifying things. Right? They were justifying their behavior and acts because in the end it served the religion, right? And so we've got to make sure that we don't do that. We've seen that a lot in churches and in religious organizations where, well, the ends justifies the means. It's okay if I lie, right? It's okay if I go around discrediting this person because in the end it justifies. I mean, it's okay if I tell people they got to do this stuff even though they really don't have to, because in the end it justifies the means, right? Because either I get more money out of it or I get more power out of it, or however you want to play that around. And there's a lot of different scenarios, right? But that's what they were doing. And so we need to make sure that we don't do that. So I know I've kind of gone through a lot of the different pieces there, and we're only to verse 42. So I'm going to sit here and I'm going to hit verse 42, 43, and 44. It says, "What sorrow awaits you, you Pharisees?" So he's just talking to the Pharisees right now. So keep that in mind. "For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens." They would literally like divide it out, weigh it, give 10%. I mean, they would go so detailed into all those things that I mean, it was ridiculous how much they would do everything to show how they were doing. But then he says, "But you ignore justice and the love of God." I mean, you're ignoring you're doing all these religious acts, right? Mostly traditions, but you're ignoring justice and love. And so He says, and so he stops. Yes, you should tithe. Yes, but do not neglect the more important things. And that's the one thing we've got to as Christians in the church, we've got to realize what is the most important thing. What is it, right? And if you ask a lot of people, say, "Oh well, you got to be at church on Sundays and Wednesdays too." And if you're not, then you're not committed, right? And then you've got to give, and you give it better be at least 10%. And then you've got to take communion, and you've got to do this, and you've got to serve, and you've got to check all these boxes. And if you don't check all these boxes, well, then you're not a real Christian. That's Phariseeism, right? That all of that, every single bit of that is Phariseeism, because you're saying doing all these things makes you a good Christian, right? Back in the day, they said doing all these things is what made you a good Jew, and Jesus is like, no, it's love and justice and mercy. That's what makes, those are the more important things. That's what makes you a good person, a good Christian, or in this sense, a good Jew. And then he says in verse 43, what sorrow awaits you, Pharisees, for you love to sit in the seats of honor in the synagogues and receive respectful greetings as you walk in the marketplace. Yes, what sorrow awaits you, for you are like hidden graves in a field. People walk over them without knowing the corruption they are stepping on. So this was a huge insult, right? This was a horrible, horrible insult that he just gave them. We're like, were they just called? No, because to walk across a grave was to be considered unclean. And so what he's telling them is like, you all are so unclean, right? The way you act, the way you behave, you are so unclean that the people around you are that come in contact with you, right, are unclean as well. And that's what he's referring to. And so, you know, we've got to make sure that we don't get caught up in that. Don't be a Christian on the inside only, but bring your inner life under God's control, and your outer life will reflect it. That's the thing we've got to realize, right? So often we want to work on the outside. We want to work on the appearance, right? We want to appear holy. We want to appear self-righteous, right? We're better than all these. Look how wonderful and holy we are. And then it's like, oh, then, no, right? Realize how dirty we are, how messed up we are, how sinful we are, right? And then accept Jesus. And then that's where this light that we talked about yesterday comes into play, because then that light's going to shine. Because when right now, if your Christianity is like, look at all these things that I'm doing, you're just bragging about yourself, right? And you're still unclean on the inside. And then those around you are going to see that, and that's what the Pharisees were doing. So we need to do that. And so we need to make sure that, like these unmarked graves, that we're not corrupting people like the Pharisees were just by being around them. And so he goes in, and so verse 45, teacher, which I'll give this guy credit. He called him rabbi, teacher. He said an expert in religious law. This is an expert in the religious law. He says, you have insulted us too, right? And what you just said. He's like, look, you just insulted us. And Jesus responds now to the religious leaders. And that first part was talking to the Pharisees. And again, a lot of these were a combination of both. Yes, he said Jesus. What sorrow also awaits you, experts in religious law. For you crush people with embarrassed religious demands, and you never lift a finger to ease their burden. What sorrow awaits you, for you build monuments for the prophets your own ancestors killed long ago. But in fact, you stand as witnesses who agree with what your ancestors did. He's calling them murderers. Right? So he's telling the Pharisees they're unclean, that they're unmarked graves that are just nasty. And then he's telling the religious leaders that they're basically murderers. He says, you stand as witnesses and you agree with what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you joined in their crime by building them monuments. This is what God in his wisdom said about you. I will send prophets and apostles to them, but they will kill some and persecute the others. He knows what they're thinking about doing to him. He knows what they're going to do. As a result, this generation will be held responsible for the murder of all God's prophets from the creation of the world, from the murder of Abel to the murder of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, it will certainly be charged against this generation. And what he's talking about here is that he knows this generation is going to kill him. Right? This is what he's getting at. What sorrow awaits you, experts in religious law, for you remove the key to knowledge And again, we got to be careful not to do this. We do this. Oh goodness, we do this so many times, right? It depends on where you're at, but like, you'll see like religious organizations are like, well, you can only read these books, right? Or you can only read authors from these group of people, or you can only believe this. All right, this is what we believe in. So if you're going to be part of our group, and again, this is across this is across religion, but it's a lot across Christianity. Different denominations, a lot of them do this, and we've got to be careful not to get caught up in this, because it removes. Right, he says, "For you remove the key to knowledge from the people, you don't enter the kingdom yourselves, and you prevent others from entering." And that, I mean, that's just dangerous. You do not want to be that person, right? Right? You know, and that's where we got to get caught up in that law we talked about yesterday with the light, and thinking we have light, but we actually have darkness, because we think we know it all. We think we have all the answers, and you have to believe this. You have to believe this set of rules, these set of things, beliefs, and if you don't, then you can't be part of our group. And then then they'll go as far as, well, you can't be part of our group, and you're not really a Christian if you don't believe these set of rules. And it's like, whoa, we've got to be so careful not to get caught up in this. And unfortunately, we have. And I don't understand sometimes how we miss all these warnings from Jesus. And if you actually look at a lot of Jesus's teachings, most of it's on this type of stuff that the Pharisees go into, and the way that he spends a good portion of or the writers of the Gospels cover a good portion of him constantly calling out what the Pharisees are doing and how we should be counteractive. But unfortunately, in Christianity today, we look more like the Pharisees in many cases than we do the people that were following Jesus and Jesus. And so with that, and that's why I'm so harsh on this, and that's why I come down on this, is because I've experienced it myself as a Christian, right? And I've spent a lot of time with people who've left Christianity, who've experienced it really, really hard and really bad. And so, the things that have been said to them, the things that have been done to them by people who call themselves Christians, it's hard to watch. And so, we've got to come down hard on this as a group. We've got to look at ourselves and say, hey, man, we can't do this anymore. We can't be like this, right? I mean, look at all the warnings that Jesus gives. Look at all the names he's calls them fools, hypocrites, right? All kind of things, that filthy people, right? Greedy and wicked. And so I don't want to be lumped into that. And I've gotten caught up in this stuff. And so that's why I'm very careful not to. And I know I still will. And so I try to keep an open mind. And so we've got to be very diligent and not allowing this. And so to finish this off, as Jesus was, so he apparently said all this and left. As he was leaving, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees became hostile and tried to provoke him with many questions. And they wanted to trap him into saying something they could use against him. Again, they don't have anything. He's calling them out, right? He's telling them the truth about how they really are. And so it just makes them angry. And so they continue to try to find things. Eventually, we're going to see they make them up. That's how they're able to crucify him. And so when we go back and look at that last part, right, with the prophets, God's prophets have been persecuted and murdered throughout history by the Jewish people, right? Mostly the religious leaders, and so we see that over and over again. And so he's basically just accusing them. Look, you're no different. You are no different. In fact, you're so bad. You're going to finalize it all up with killing the Son of God, killing your Messiah, the Messiah who's coming. You're going to end up killing him. The one you're looking for, you're going to end up killing him. And so they end up doing that. And so how did the legal experts remove the key to knowledge? Right? How are they doing that? How are they preventing people from coming and learning? So it was through their what they call erroneous interpretations of Scripture, and we do that a lot, right? The biggest thing we do is proof text, and that's the worst thing we can do. We take one verse in the Bible and we say, well, because this one verse says this one thing, it applies to all people for all time, right? And it's like, no, you're ignoring 95% of the Bible to get to just that one verse. And so we've got to we do that. Oh, we do that so bad. And so we've got to make sure we don't do that. And so then they were adding man-made rules on top of it. So they would take a verse and then we add man-made rules on top of it. And it's like, well, we've did this, so we've got to do that. And now then what these man-made rules become traditions, and now later on, then traditions become, we make traditions gospel and we ignore the gospel. Right? I talked about that before. It's like there were things that, where I used to go, like you could come in and do them, And if you did it, man, people would just absolutely freak out. They'd walk out. You wouldn't be welcome back. But yet we were just ignoring the direct commands. We were taking things that were man made and making them like scripture, right? And we would just, I mean, church. We would split a church over. We would walk away. We would leave a church over things that were tradition. But as a church as a whole, and I'm not somewhere where I used to go, but a Christian as a whole is ignoring the direct commands of Jesus, one being the Great Commission. So we've gotten caught up in those traditions and those man-made things, and it's keeping people out. And that's what we don't realize. We're so inward focused on these things that those inward things that we're focused on are actually keeping people out. And so, on top of all that, they were bad examples, arguing their way out of demanding rules, right? They would place on others. They would say you have to do this, but then they wouldn't live it in their own lives. And we see that a lot too. And again, I'm not calling for perfection in the church. I want y'all to understand. I'm not calling for perfection. We're human, right? The church is imperfect. We're going to mess up all the time, right? But this is serious stuff, right? This isn't, hey, I sinned, I messed up. This is structured behavior, organized behavior, stuff that we grab onto and hold on to and won't let go and won't admit, say, hey, you know what? That's okay. Let's forget about that. Let's move on and let's do what Christ called us to do, right? And so we've got to make sure that we don't get caught up, right? Caught up in a religion. So many people, a lot of people have got caught up in a religion of their own making, and they can no longer lead the people to God. And I've seen that, right? We're seeing that in the church. And I mentioned this the other day. One of the worst things, or one of the biggest things driving people from the church is the church, right? It's not, hey, we can't live this way. It's not, hey, it's the church. And so that's unfortunate. But I've sat down and I've had these conversations and I've talked to a lot of people about, hey, why are you not, well, why would I go to a church anymore? Right? It's like, I understand. I'm not going to go into the details of a lot of them because, but it's like, I understand where they're coming from, right? I understand it. And in many cases, they're right. And I hate to say that, but in many cases, they are right. And so my call is that we stop closing the door of God's love to people and throwing away the key, because that's what we're doing, right? We do that so many times. And so that's my call. And so this is a good thing. I know this section has been hard. So here's the positive side of this. We can change all of that. If we take our focus and focus on Jesus, right? Focus on Jesus and filter the Bible through Jesus, what he asked us to do, how he asked us to treat people. I can honestly guarantee you, right? I can read the Bible, I can look through it, and there's not going to be an attendance book in heaven, right? There's not going to be a ledger of how much money you gave. There's not going to be a ledger of how many times you gave communion or took communion, right? There's not going to be, if we're going to get to these verses, and the main thing that we're going to be judged on when we get to heaven is how we treated other people. And that's the only example we have that Jesus gives of what judgment day is going to be like. It's going to be based on how we treated other people, because like I've talked about before, right? The horizontal and the vertical, right? If this is good, you're going to treat other people really awesome, really great, right? If your relationship between God and you is good, right? All those other things don't matter. It's how you treat people, right? Because you can have perfect, you could be at church every time the doors are open, every time there's a worship, and still be a Pharisee, right? But you could maybe make it a fourth of the time and be more like Jesus. And so that's what I'm trying to get at here, right? You may not be able to give a ton of money, but man, maybe you can give a ton of yourself to other people and to serving and to bringing people to Christ, because that's what it was about. It was about caring for people, loving people, not trying to make people obey a bunch of rules. That was never what Christianity was about, right? That's one of the things why we call ourselves simply church, because it is simple. And I've said this a lot of times, it's simple. Right? The things to do are simple, but it's hard. It's very hard. Those things are hard. It's honestly, sometimes it's very easy to do the check boxes that we come up with. It's easy to check boxes. It's hard to go beyond that and be like Christ and treat people the way we're supposed to be treated. Again, I know this one's a little bit longer, and I know it's a little more on the negative bent, and I'm trying not to do that as much. But we have to be realistic in the times. We have to study, right? Just do a little bit of research on what's happening inside the church and why people are leaving, why we've lost like 40 million people since 2000. There's a reason for this, and it's because we look more like Pharisees sometimes, or a lot of times now, than we do like Jesus, and so it's driving people away. Again, but we can turn that around. That's the positive side of this. We can turn that around. We don't have to be that way. We don't. And there are a lot of good people doing that. There are a lot of good people turning that around. And that's the message, and that's the positivity, and that's the thing we need to before say, hey, this is the warning. Let's not be like this. We don't have to be like this. It's easy to get caught up in that. I understand that it is. But we don't have to be it. And Jesus is calling us to be a group of people who just love people. Show them kindness, show them mercy, show them grace. Focus on that. Make that the most important thing. And then everything else work its way out. Again, I appreciate everyone who watches these, who takes the time to listen to them. I hope that you get something out of them. I know I do, just from studying and going deep into these. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please go ahead and do so. We're going to continue to try to push into these and push into these studies. And as always, I appreciate everyone for watching.